Good afternoon, and thank you for tuning in to today's program with one of my favorite novelists, William Boyd, and his brilliant editor, Diana Miller. I'm Andrea Grossman, the founder of Writer's Block, now in our 28th season. I'm so grateful to Will that he can join us from his home in London, and to Diana, who joins us from New York. I welcome all of you wherever you are. I'm here in LA, and who knows where all of you are anyway. When you have questions, email them to us at reservations@writersblockpresents.com. Now for today. I love William Boyd's novels, but the romantics swept me into another world. Boyd takes us through 19th century Europe, Africa, Sri Lanka, and America. Our hero, Cashel, is a restless adventurer, a hapless misadventurer, prone to making decisions that might make even Dickens wince. What a literary amalgam we've got in our hero. He's part Dickensian, part Wordsworth, with a dash of Goethe and Kerouac thrown in too. Our Cashel is a romantic through and through, sensitive, reflective, pure-hearted, with a moral compass firmly rooted in place. He's impractical to a fault and guided by a passionate conviction to know himself. His years in Africa and Sri Lanka are agonizing for him, but were shocking to me as a reader. Not Britain's finest moments in colonial history, I have to say, as Boyd takes us through Sri Lanka. I mean, it was just amazing. Cashel's travails made me take a sidebar into some quick research, and any book that makes a reader do that expands the bounds of this fiction. A great editor helps an author fully realize his talents, and based on this book alone, Diana Miller, vice president and executive editor at Knopf, is clearly exceptional. She's been at Knopf for 20 years and has shepherded so many great authors and their ideas to real acclaim. Chevalier's bookstore has copies of The Romantics, and I urge you to read it. I'm so proud to welcome Diana Miller and William Boyd. And again, when you have questions, please email them to reservations@writersblockpresents.com, and we will address them in a while. Thanks. I now present Diana Miller and Will Boyd.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you, Will. And I should say also, because I don't want to take any additional credit here, Will has, several wonderful editors, including an editor in the UK. And so it's my great privilege to be his American editor. But I should say, even though we've had some fun discussions about the book, I would in no way want to take credit for anything in these pages. It's all you, Will, and your work before it came to me. But it's especially fun. We were talking before this about how virtual events enable us to all be together in what feels like the same room, because ordinarily we might not be able to have this conversation in person. And so welcome, Will. I concur with
Diana. Thank you. Lovely to see you. Lovely to be here. Very happy to be talking about the Romantic and its American life, which is fairly recent, isn't it? It's only been out for a few weeks, so I'm full of vim and vigor.
Excellent. Well, yes, and it's appearing in many countries. It was exciting to hear also about the German publication and the French publication, and it seems especially appropriate for a book that roves as much as this one to have such warm receptions in other parts of the world.
Yes, the translations, of course, take many months to come to fruition, but it's been published in France, Italy, and Germany in the last few weeks. And I think, it's interesting that the response has been fantastic. So I think there's something about romanticism or a romantic heart or a romantic person that appeals to all kinds of readers. And the Spanish publication is coming up and the Portuguese as well. So I think that something universal about Cashel's nature and the predicaments that he finds himself in.
Yes, indeed. And actually, I wanted to start by asking you to reflect a little bit on the title, because as Andrea was describing, Cashel is a romantic, and I feel like we could describe him as a romantic with a capital R and as a romantic with a little r. And I'm curious about whether the title was living in you all along alongside the novel, or did it come later?
No, it's one of those titles that arrived early. I mean, sometimes it's the 11th hour if I get the right title. But I was at Oxford University doing a PhD on the romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. And so I'm steeped in that historical era, the first 30 years of the 19th century, which was the Romantic period. And I was reading a book by another 19th century author, a French author who probably not much read in Anglo-Saxon countries, Stendhal. He's still very much read in France. And Stendhal, who wrote The Red and the Black and The Charterhouse of Parma, two classic novels of the 19th century, described himself as a romantic, but he saw it as a disease. And I thought that was a very interesting concept, the extent to which your nature, your personality can be a blessing or a curse. And so these two things, my romantic sort of scholarly past, if you like, and this inspiration from Stendhal, who was a most curious and fascinating writer and an individual in his own right, came together. And I thought, I'm going to write a book about somebody who has this proclivity, and we will see over the course of his life whether it is a disease or a benediction, a blessing or a curse. And so that was the beginning of the novel for me. This sense of an examination of a type, a human personality, and that's strictly categorized, and to see what the consequences of that having that personality were over a long life.
And I note also there's a beautiful epigraph from Stendhal in the front
Yes.
of the novel. And even the fact, I mean, a novel is a mirror taking a walk down a big road. And one of the conceits of this novel is that it, in fact, is a true story. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it purports to be a true story. I mean, one of the things I do in my fiction, I look back, there was no plan that I had when I set out as a writer, but I look back at the novels I've written, and I see that time and again, I'm trying to make fiction seem so real that the reader begins to forget it's fiction. In a way, I'm trying to use fiction to colonize the world of the real, which we are dominated by with reportage and 24-hour news cycles and so on and so forth. And we sometimes forget that, in fact, the best way of understanding ourselves is by reading novels, because only through novels do you get access to other people's interior lives. Other people in the real world are opaque and mysterious, but in novels they're not. And so it's a great medium for understanding this strange adventure that we're all on. And one of the ways I've exploited it is by writing fictions that, in a way, as I say, colonize the world of the real. I mean, I've used photographs, I've used the journal form, I use footnotes, and I've had indexes in novels. And in this novel, I have little drawings, in fact, little plans and sort of almost plans of buildings, plans of battlefields. And all of which, and there are footnotes, all of which adds up to this kind of framing device that I was given a partial autobiography of this man, Cashel Greville Ross, and a few artifacts that remained of him. And I decided, rather than write a biography about this man, I would write a novel. But in fact, he is a creature of my imagination. But I framed it as if he did live. And of course, he meets real people. He's at real events. He's at the Battle of Waterloo. He meets Percy Shelley and Lord Byron. He discovers the source of the Nile before anybody else. So there's a sense in which he is rooted in the 19th century, the real 19th century, but in fact, he's a fictional character.
And how over the course of the writing did you choose sort of what the highlights of his life would be? Because he has a very long life full of adventures, and it seems like there was probably an array of different moments you could have chosen for him? How did you focus on these?
Well, a lot of them were just things I was interested in. I have this definition of a novel, which is a novel is a sum of all the things that the author is interested in at the time of writing, and that really applies to me. So the whole Shelley and Byron chapters, are easily explained because I was steeped in it. But I was born and raised in Africa, so I thought I would take him off to Africa, and I'm a sort of expert on the great explorers of the 19th century. I've written a mini series about them, so I had a lot of information to hand, and so I sent him off to places that were I was intrigued about, or events I was intrigued about, people I was intrigued about. But I was also thinking about the Romantic period and the Romantic novel of the 19th century. And you can't really write a 19th century novel without having the Battle of Waterloo in it. So I thought, well, I better put the Battle of Waterloo in. And I was also curious about this idea that the Romantics had of creating an ideal society, a sort of totally egalitarian, trouble-free republic, if you like, of like-minded souls. And in the 19th century, many of these putative colonies were in the US, in America. And then I thought of Thoreau and Hawthorne and Americanicism. So I thought, well, I've got to have he's got to go off to the US and start a colony of like-minded souls in a true romantic spirit. And so bit by bit, all these elements came together. And I always prepare a novel in great detail before I start writing it. And I sort of blocked out the chapters in his long life. And of course, he had to have a passionate love affair that goes terribly wrong. And he's rueful for the rest of his life. Can he regain this person he clearly loves to distraction? So all these elements that are kind of subsumed in the title, the romantic, went into constructing his rambunctious existence.
Yes, well, and one of the great pleasures of the book, I think, is that while you're absorbed in it, it does feel as if you're reading a 19th century novel. It has that sense of adventure and the just wonderfully consuming, absorbing world that you step right into. But as you tip your hand in the opening, there's also a contemporary lens through which we're seeing all these things that happen. And I think that adds just an extra fascinating layer, because things that maybe Cashel thinks are okay, or might be appropriate for a man of the time, feel a little bit different when you're a contemporary reader. So is that something you were intending?
Yes, I mean, in a way, because there's an author's note at the front of the book, which is me speaking to you, the readers, explaining how come I'm writing this book. And, I'm a kind of editorial presence, if you like, because I supply footnotes and explanations and commentary on Cashel's life, because it's written in the third person singular. It's not a first person novel. So there is a sense, and that's that as you say, the lens through which his life is being looked at is me, if you like, and I'm a man of the 21st century looking back at the way people behaved and thought and acted. Though I do think they were extraordinary people, the early romantics. I mean, as radical as young people are today. I mean, Shelley was extremely left-wing. He was a vegetarian. It didn't stop him from behaving badly. He was an atheist. He was an anti-monarchist. Very kind of contemporary feelings. But there is always, because of the framing device, a sense of distance, that I am presenting this to you with my sensibility, my modern sensibility, if you like, and I'm not trying to write a pastiche 19th century novel.
And were there things where you really sort of, and Andrea refers to this, decisions that Cashel makes? There are these so many moments where, as a reader, you can kind of see the potentially bad decision coming that he's about to make. That sense of, oh no, please don't do that, or think of this again. Was there anything that stood out to you as something that you had to make sure that Cashel did, but you, the writer, almost couldn't bear it?
Well, I think it was more to do with this idea of his nature. I mean, if you have a simple definition of a romantic personality, you might say it's somebody who listens to their heart, not to their head. And if you listen to your heart, you can get things, incredibly wrong if you don't step back and rationalize. And in a way, that's the influence of Stendhal. That's why he felt he was cursed by his romanticism, or he saw it as a malady, that because he was so romantic, he kept making terrible decisions. He kept falling in love with the wrong people and so on. But I think Cashel does make huge blunders. I mean, the way he loses the love of his life is sheer intemperate, thoughtless, acting without thinking. And it's something that he regrets for the rest of his life, even though they meet up at the end of their lives when they're both elderly people. But it's that, and we all know that kind of forking path that can appear in your life, and you think, well, shall I go this way? Shall I go that way? And depending on your nature, you might make a wise decision, or you might make a foolhardy decision, because Cashel is impulsive and passionate. He often makes the wrong decision. He teams up with people who are ripping him off. He embarks on a love affair in America because his impulsive marriage has gone hideously wrong. So he's very human, I think, and we're none of us paragons. We all have flaws, and so he is. I think his value systems are basically good, but because of his nature, he finds himself in terrible predicaments.
Well, you sound as if you have a lot of affection for Cashel.
Well, I think I do. I mean, he is a creature by imagination. He's never took me over, but I think I am actually quite a romantic person myself, and so my nature is romantic, leavened with rationality. But so I sort of understand the way I made him act, if you know what I mean. I steered him in directions that were directions that, had I been in his place, I might have gone down that road myself. So there's a sense in which his personality chimes with mine. But I remember Vladimir Nabokov, one of my favorite authors, was asked this very question: does the character you're writing about ever take you over as a novelist and somehow dictate to you what should happen in the novel? And Nabokov said, no, absolutely not. All my characters are galley slaves, and I'm the man on the deck with a whip. And in a way, that's my stance as well. I make them up and I make them do what I want. But of course, there is a large element of the unconscious at play in any act of creation. And so sometimes you don't know precisely why you've written a particular episode or chosen one of the paths of the forking paths that are presented to the character.
That makes a lot of sense. And yes, that very famous quote from Nabokov. Yes, I imagine if you're in too much of a tug of war with your fictional creation, it would make for a very tumultuous writing process.
Yeah, and it is a romantic notion that somehow these people you invent, take on a life of their own and steer the story in a way you didn't want it to go. I mean, I don't believe it actually, but a lot of writers, claim that. But I'm the man on the deck with a whip, and they do my bidding.
Yes. Well, and I was thinking about it's so interesting because Cashel, as we were saying, is guided by love, and there's a way to read this novel as a great love story, a story of his great love for Raffaella and the ways he gets farther from her and then is able to come back to her. But I was noticing also, there are so many moments where something very rational and sort of cold and hard has to divert him from his course. That concerns about money and concerns about inheritance and things that he's doing that are outside of the law and the ways that he gets in trouble. I mean, do you see these as sort of competing impulses? I mean, we've talked about the romantic and the rational, but is there also a sort of practicality that if you're a romantic, you're not thinking about money or legality or that kind of thing?
Yes, I mean, there's a whole episode where, Cashel becomes a drug addict to this readily available opiate called laudanum. And again, that's a nod to the romantic tradition, because practically every single person in the 19th century took laudanum, including apparently Queen Victoria. She was allegedly quite addicted to it. But it was basically a heroin. It was opium in solution. And so if you had a toothache or you were feeling blue, you reached for your bottle of laudanum and had a swig. But in Cashel's case, it's in the way that it did with, famously with Coleridge and De Quincey, these 19th century writers who became addicts. It takes over his life for a while, and he manages to wrest himself back. So it's a roller coaster, but then I think, all lives are roller coasters, however humble. And because he's living, an adventurous life, and because his life takes him here and there, and his encounters are pretty extraordinary. But there's still an element in which he is a kind of everyman, and in a way, 19th century lives were as, vivid and as violent and as globe-trotting as our lives today in the 21st century. I remember I was researching a lot about Anthony Trollope, a later 19th century writer. And Trollope went to America 6 times. He went to Australia twice. He went to South Africa. And this is when it took you 6 months to get to South Africa, or 9 months to get to Australia. Yet he was a really widely traveled man, and yet he had a job in the British Post Office for most of his life. So Trollope's life is as extraordinary as Cashel's life in a way. And then there are other 19th century figures whose lives are even more extraordinary. I mean, Charles Darwin, spent 8 years at sea and came back and wrote The Origin of the Species. So Cashel's life is in a way very typical, even though it might seem wildly adventurous.
And the fact that he's not only is he traveling everywhere, but he's receiving, I think in this world, contemporary world where we're connected and we're sort of receiving news all the time, he also has these periods of isolation where he doesn't know what's happening. I'm thinking as one example of when, after he arrives in America and he's waiting, and I guess I should give some context to the audience, but he manages to get himself out of debtor's prison, and he has a dream with one of his fellow prisoners that they're going to go to America and set up one of these idealistic romantic colonies that they want to call Libertania. And he goes first, and he leaves some money for the family to follow him. And of course, they don't make it. And he's in the dark about that for a long time. I mean, do you want to tell us a little bit more about the context for that?
Yes, I mean, it's to do with the research, and you realize it's so easy for us to communicate today. I mean, effortless, instant. But it took approximately, I did a lot of research into the postal history of Europe and America. But if you wrote somebody, Cashel is briefly in India as a soldier, and if you wrote to somebody in England from India, on average, it took 9 months for that letter to arrive. And then it would take 9 months for the reply to arrive. So a year and a half has gone by before you got a reply to your letter. Well, just try to imagine what that must be like. People could have died or remarried, given birth in between. And so I was very conscious writing the novel of the way technology was slowly changing over the course of Cashel's life. He's born in 1799, he dies in 1882. The world had changed in a way that, our 20th, 21st century world had changed. And when he was born, it was coach and horses. it would take you 8 or 9 hours to get from Oxford to London, which is only 50 miles. But at the end of his life, he can catch a train and it takes an hour. And that the railroad transformed the Western world. It transformed Europe. It transformed America. And then along came the telegraph, when you could send a message that would be received within an hour, as opposed to, months or weeks. And so once communication and travel changed, then everything began to change, not least, lavatories and electric and lighting in your house. So I was very conscious writing this long life over the 19th century of how it would change. And so I hope, subtly pointed out how communications sped up, how transport massively changed, and how everybody's lives were different. And Cashel, at the end of his life, goes to a hotel in Baden-Baden in Germany, and he gets in an elevator and he goes into his room, he switches on electric light, and there's a flushing toilet. Whereas at his birth, he had a chamber pot, a candle, and he had to climb up the stairs. So it was that sort of detail in a way that brings the world alive. And so you as a novelist, you don't just stick your research in, you find a way of making it intrinsic to the story you're telling. And so, as you say, that when Cashel is waiting for news of the people who are going to start the colony, what can he do? If no letter arrives, he goes to Boston and stands on the docks waiting for the ships from England, just in case they get off, but they don't. So and then eventually a letter arrives and he realizes what's happened. But it just makes that world come alive in a way that we in the 20th century might not understand, or assume that everybody was in easy communication with each other. Not at all. It must have been very, very strange.
And it's one of the thrills of the book, I think, when a letter arrives, we often get to see the letter in the book. So we're almost reading it alongside Cashel, sort of breathlessly looking for what news this letter might be carrying. It's a fun device.
There are lots of letters in the book, and of course, it is a great device. But also, that's the only time when I sort of, as it were, change my voice. That it's written in my voice. But when you read the letters, you're reading the 19th century voice with its vocabulary and its mannerisms and its mores. And so it suddenly takes you back into the 1820s, the 1840s, in a I hope a very realistic way, and you realize how people spoke to each other. I mean, I actually think I can prove it, but I think if you were chatting to Lord Byron, you'd talk to him pretty much as you and I are talking. There'd be differences in vocabulary, and we might not be as frank with each other or use certain expressions. But I think that the demotic everyday speech in the 19th century was remarkably similar to ours, given these essential differences. So my dialogue in the book seems quite modern, but actually I did a tremendous amount of research to try and find out the actual way people spoke. And I went to letters and I went to journals, where people were not writing for posterity, but were writing for themselves. And of course, they wrote very much as we would write today, with the odd grammatical exception or the odd difference in vocabulary.
When you were talking about the big changes in this swath of history, and Andrea also referred to sort of moments in the history of the British Empire that the book seems to zero in on, some highs and lows. And do you see this 19th century period as being an especially pivotal one in the history of empire and of the country?
Well, I think it is, or we do here in Great Britain. Half the map was painted red, and the British Empire, spanned the globe. It was not necessarily a sunny time for all populations, but it's part of the myth of the British people in a way. And now that empire is gone, and we're a sort of second-rate country, it lingers on in the popular memory. I mean, I was born in a British colony. I mean, this dates me. I was born in a West African country which was called the Gold Coast. It's now Ghana, renamed it independent. So I grew up in a way in that empire. And so in the funny sort of way, another thing that this novel does is it, because I've now written 17 novels, I'm sort of, there are touchstones that refer to my earlier work, you know, like Colonial Wars. My second novel is about the First World War in East Africa. The Byron and Shelley encounters refer to my 8 years of doctoral research that didn't produce a finished thesis at the end of it. So there are lots of aspects of my novels that come into this particular novel because of its range and its scale. And there are little echoes of my previous work, or places I've been, or situations that I've investigated before that I'm revisiting as a sort of indulgence as I'm now in the, you know, the not, I hope it's not the end game of my writing career, but I'm well over halfway, you know. So
Yes.
I sort of inevitably have these reference points that I highlight or subtly underline.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the aspects of the novel that also stands out and speaks to your earlier work is this idea of the whole life novel, which you've spoken and written about. Will you tell us a little bit about what a whole life novel is?
Yes, it's something I sort of stumbled across, and I've sort of made it my own in a way, if that doesn't sound too grandiose. I wrote a novel in 1987, which is my fourth novel, called The New Confessions, which covers most of the 20th century, the life of a Scottish film director who was born in 1899 and who dies in the 1970s. And the reaction to that book was so different from the reaction to my other novels that I thought I was onto something, because it seemed to me that readers related to the central character in a way that was different from the way you normally relate to a central character in an orthodox novel. And I realized that's because you had all the information. You knew what this person was like as a child, and you knew what this person was like as an old person, and everything in between. And so with that information, you have the character. I mean, I've written one about a woman. This is my fourth, I think, and becomes almost like a friend or a relative, because you have all the gen. You have all the information of their ups and downs, their successes, their failures, their failed marriages, their successful marriages, their children, etc., etc. And so from time to time, I felt the urge to write one of these whole life novels, again to stimulate that kind of response. And having written three, all set in the 20th century, but one, New Confessions, Any Human Heart, and another novel I wrote called Sweet Caress, which is about a woman photographer with 77 photographs in it. You see what I mean about pushing the boundaries of fiction. I had this idea of writing one set in the 19th century. And so that was again, another stimulus for writing the romantic. And it's true that the reaction to these books is different, I think. And I get more letters about them than I do from my other novels. And I think the explanation is that the reader feels, or the readers feel, that they know this person in a way that's different from the way you might know, Huckleberry Finn or Stephen Dedalus or Mrs. Dalloway. It's different because you have every intimate detail over a long life, and that changes things.
Yes. Well, and as you were saying in the beginning, how a novel really takes us inside someone in the way other art forms can't. it's hard to think about, you know, a film or a painting or a poem that could really encompass an entire life the way a novel can. It's unique.
Yeah, yeah, more and more, I think this explains the novel's power, and why we read novels, because, you know, life is mysterious, people are mysterious. We know people have inner lives because we have an inner life, but how do we get access to that? And even if people tell you what they're thinking, are they lying? Are they telling the truth? And paradoxically, the only place where you can absolutely guarantee that the inner life of this person is true and real is in a work of fiction. If we want to know what Elizabeth Bennet is thinking about Mr. Darcy, then Jane Austen will tell us in Pride and Prejudice everything that's going on in her head. And that privileged access to the inner lives of other people, even though they're fictional, is fantastically interesting, and it helps us understand, you know, the curious adventure, as I say, that we're all embarked on, and these strangers that are surrounding us. We get an inkling of how people feel and react and suffer and exult from reading novels, not from reading histories or newspapers or biographies, or even asking people what they're thinking about. It's a very, very curious and rare facility that this particular art form offers up, and it's not echoed or replicated in the other art forms. You're absolutely right.
Well, and dear audience members, please don't just run out and get a copy of The Romantic, but also these earlier novels that Will was mentioning, like Any Human Heart, and they're wonderful and also very absorbing. And I was thinking, Will, as you were talking about that as well, do you feel that Cashel, over the course of this long and eventful life, do you think he changes? Is he different from when he starts out?
I think he is, and I think it's you know, he does have some you know, real setbacks. At the end of his life, he's almost a fugitive, you know, frightened that he might be killed by some people who he's wronged, but for a good reason. And I think that at the end of his life, and one of the bits of the novels I'm most pleased about is that when he's an old man in his early 80s, and he finally tracks down this woman, Raffaella, this Italian woman who he met and fell in love with in the 1820s, when they were both very young, and then and had been separate for such a long time. And when he encounters her again, he realizes that she's remarried, it's impossible, but he realizes that actually he cares more about what happens to her than what happens to him. And that is not the sort of situation of a selfish, romantic, egomaniac person. He sees that as a kind of definition of love. And so I think he has experienced the getting of wisdom. It's taken a long time, but he is definitely a more serene figure at the end of his life than the slightly tormented, you know, agitated person that he was at the beginning and the middle. So I think he has learned from experience, and you know, a kind of insight has arrived at him and arrived to him, and he is actually a happy man at the end of his life, even though he can't be with the woman he loves.
Yes, there was a section actually that I had flagged and was thinking about, because thinking about Raffaella, he's sort of wondering if he has this pattern or sort of problem where he's always leaving the people he loves behind.
Yes.
Not just Raffaella, but, you know, his daughters, you know, his first wife. Is that something that he just can't get away from? Is that just who he is?
Well, it's also, you know, it's circumstance as well. You know, his first marriage, or his marriage, is a disaster, and his wife goes insane. But he's had two daughters, and he tries later in life to reunite with them, and one responds and the other will have nothing to do with him. Well, that's life, isn't it? there's nothing he much as he'd like to reconnect with his eldest daughter, she will not speak to him because she blames him in some way for her mother's insanity. But he does reconcile with his second daughter, and she comes to live with him in his old age. So you can wish for something, but it may not happen. And I think that in Cashel's life, circumstance and fate and luck, which is one of the great themes of my novels, good luck and bad luck play an enormous part in your lives, in your life. And I've often, I look back at my books and I see that theme of, a person's life can be defined by all the good luck they've had and all the bad luck they've had. And, you can't do anything about it. If you have bad luck, if you didn't get that job or that person you loved didn't marry you, what can you do about it? So it's just there in your life. And so Cashel is typical of many of my heroes, particularly the central characters of my whole life novels. They want to go down a particular road. They want certain things to happen, but the way that bad luck afflicts your life prevents it from happening. So it's so he's a victim of filthy, rotten luck, as we all are.
Yes, well, and he starts off also, he's dealt an exceptionally tough hand, it seems, from the beginning. That he grows up in this deceit where he believes that he doesn't know his father. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that
So
lie?
it's in a way it's a sort of shaping aspect of his life, that he thinks he knows he's an orphan being brought up by his aunt, and his parents died in a shipwreck, and but it turns out that this is an elaborate lie, and he's not an orphan, and his real father is alive. And when in his teens he discovers this, it's a cataclysmic shock, that everything he thought was fixed and certain and true about his life turns out to be the opposite. He's not who he thinks he was, and that makes him run away from home and join the army, and he winds up as a drummer boy in the Battle of Waterloo. But that shock of thinking, and you can imagine, that everything you've been told about yourself turns out to be not true, freaks him out, and it sets him off on this journey. He is reconciled with the woman who is his real mother, but it somehow has destabilized him fundamentally, I think, and it explains to a certain extent his impulsiveness and his search for something true and something meaningful, because he was so shocked to discover that his entire being, if you like, was a fabrication.
Yes, well, and even though he sees it as a sort of hobbling thing, that he started his life out this way, I guess you could see it as the great gift that allows him to go out and make his way in the world. If he'd known who he really was, he might not have had that same drive, or you're saying that same impulsivity.
Sure, I mean that's the good. What seemed like terrible luck might actually have turned out to be not such bad luck after all, because he does recognize he's lived one hell of a life at the end of his life as well. So, in fact, I think Raffaella points that out to him when they meet at the end. She says, look how you've lived, Cashel. Look what you've experienced. If we'd got married in Ravenna in 1823, it might have been entirely different. So again, it's this sense of that it's the roll of the dice that affects your life and your progress, and no better example than Cashel's life.
Well, and there are moments actually when his parents end up sort of rescuing him from a distance, right? It's when his father dies. It's that small inheritance that enables him to leave prison, and even from afar.
Exactly. I know. I mean, there's again this sort of the familiar tropes of the romantic 19th century novel, the inheritance, changing everything. And of course, going to debtor's prison, that's the sort of nod to Charles Dickens and Little Dorrit and the Marshalsea prison. Yes, it's good fortune takes him to America, and it seems to be going well, but then the person he marries has a kind of mental breakdown and his life changes, and so he is buffeted by forces, as we all are, forces that we can't understand and we never saw coming, and when that happens, you try to make the best of it, or try to find a means of escape or something like that. And so he has good fortune, he has good, like all my characters, they have good luck from time to time, and then they have filthy rotten luck from time to time. So but that's the human condition.
And was there a section of the book that stands out to you as one that was the most fun to write, or one where you sort of let yourself run wild?
Yes, I really enjoyed writing it, and because I've written these novels set in the 20th century, and I'm very at home in the 20th century and what has occurred in the 21st century, but I'm not as at home in the 19th century. So I had to do a tremendous amount of reading and research. So it was an education for me, as well as even like how much did it cost to pay the turnpike at Oxford to go, that sort of thing. But one of the bits I was most pleased about, in a way, as I spent 8 years at Oxford University as a teacher, but also trying to write this wretched PhD thesis on Shelley's poems. And I was starting to write, and I was distracted by my embryonic novel writing career, and I was teaching too much. So I never finished my thesis, but I had all this, I wrote about 3/4 of it. So I had all this information about Shelley. And in a way, one of the things I was most pleased about was that full circle, I was able to put Percy, Byshe, Shelley, and Lord Byron, for good measure, in my novel, and show them as real people, not as myths, not as central casting romantic poets, real complicated, not particularly nice people. And I always thought that my old PhD supervisor would be very pleased to see that all his frustrations had come to some sort of fruition in this novel. So I really enjoyed writing that section of the novel. It's in 1822, when Shelley and Byron were living in Pisa. And actually, when I was doing my research, I went to Pisa. I went to Shelley's house, the last house he lived in. I stood on the beach in Viareggio, where his body washed up after he drowned at sea. So I had visited all these bits of Italy, as if somehow that was going to inspire my doctorate. But it was very nice or satisfying to recycle that in a way that would be far more entertaining to people than reading my dry as dust, thoughts about Shelley's poetry.
Was there any morsel of research that you were completely fascinated by but couldn't fit into the novel in some way that was on the cutting room floor?
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing about researching a novel is that in a way you have to throw out 90% of everything you've discovered, because the novel just becomes hopelessly overburdened. And so you have to you're like a sort of jackdaw, if you like, looking for the nice shiny paste jewel that will do a lot of work for you. And I think it's a particular talent, actually, that I've learned in the course of writing, to know just how much research to put in, just how much detail can irradiate a passage and make it seem of that time and real. And so there's masses of stuff that I didn't put in in every single chapter, in a way, because the book would have been 2,000 pages long. I don't think you'd be very happy about that. But there's nothing, the great thing about writing a novel as opposed to writing a history or a biography is that you only use what works for you. You can discard and reshape. It's a work of fiction. So all the stuff that went in, all the kind of granular 19th century detail is to do with moving the story along, giving context, making the past come alive. And in a way, those were the shiny paste jewels that caught my eye as I read my way through, volume after volume, and took notes. So I don't think there's, if there had been anything I really wanted to put in, I'd have put it in. So I'd have found a way of putting it in. So nothing's been discarded, but I do have great piles of books on, road transport in northern England in the 19th century and things like that, which, I will never open again, that's for sure. But that's it. You almost have to do the research in order to be able to write confidently. You have to know, you feel confident about how would somebody get from Paris to Marseille in 1818, you have to know how that would be and how it fits into the novel. But you have to be ruthless and discard so much interesting stuff that you find in order not to weigh the novel down, fatally.
Yes, and that succeeds beautifully, the novel, whereas it's researched very lightly. You don't feel like you're being given information as a reader. You're just in the world. I see Andrea is here, so maybe are there, we could keep talking for another hour, but are there questions from the audience?
We do have some questions. Diana, you actually stole a couple of my questions that I had word for word. The cutting room floor one was my first question because I can't even imagine what didn't make it into this book. I want to know. So I have a few, and the audience have sent in some. So let's start with this one. You give Byron and Shelley, as you mentioned, a lot of exposure, but not great publicity. Byron has a thing for teenage girls, and Shelley has a thing for girls, period. You're an expert on the Romantic period, and I do want to say this is my footnote, that were I your supervising professor at Oxford, Will, I would have passed you a PhD, an honorary PhD based on this book, and I really doubt your dissertation would have been dry as dust. Okay, that was a quick diversion.
Thank you.
What other figures from the Romantic movement or any other movement would you have worked into the narrative had you had time and space?
Well, I think they're very interesting people. Coleridge was a really weird guy, for example. De Quincey, who wrote Confessions of an English Opium Eater, was the source for a lot of my information about Cashel's drug addiction to laudanum. And there are other real people, the real, like the African explorers Richard Speke and Richard Burton, were real people. Burton is a completely fascinating, strange human being. So I put everybody I was interested in into the book, given that I was telling Cashel's story, and in giving him encounters with these various real people who actually existed. I've done it all the time in my fiction. I've written short stories about Anton Chekhov, about Ludwig Wittgenstein, Johannes Brahms. But if I'm intrigued by a historical figure, I often think of a way of writing a fiction about that person, just to somehow lift them out of biography and somehow imagine them living, breathing human beings who we might bump into. So I rove far and wide, and I put James Joyce into a novel, for example. I'm fascinated by James Joyce. He was in my novel Love is Blind. So I'm always doing it, and who knows who else will find their way as an extra in my next novel. I think in this case, in the case of the Romantic, everybody I wanted to put in is there, with the one exception of Stendhal, this amazing French writer whose real name was Henri Beyle. And I'm actually thinking of writing a novel about Henri Beyle because he was so strange and so interesting and modern a character. But his spirit sort of lurks in the novel, but he's referenced in the novel, but he didn't quite live in the period that I was writing about, so I couldn't factor him in. But so he's the only one I'm sorry not to have put in, but I will make amends in the future.
Weren't people reading his novels in your book? Well, I believe so, right? Was somebody caught reading one of Stendhal's books, possibly?
He's interesting, Stendhal, because he was a writer, but he was also a diplomat. He was a consul for the French Republic, and he was very briefly a consul in Trieste, as of course Cashel is a consul in
Right.
Trieste for the Republic of Nicaragua, of all places. So that's another place where Stendhal's real life and Cashel's fictional life overlap. So he does appear in the novel as a reference point, but he's also there as one of the two epigraphs. One of them is Stendhal's, the other is John Keats, two classic romantic figures. I sort of would have liked to have put Stendhal in the novel, but his life was lived just before Cashel's in a way. He was he didn't overlap enough to sort of lasso him and drag him into the corral.
Here's one from the audience. Talk about your research on the American chapters, creating beer with Cashel's loyal servant, for example, and selling ice from his frozen pond in Massachusetts. Did selling ice really happen? But talk about how you learned about making beer.
Well, I've never made beer, so that's pure. In fact, it's lager. It's not beer. It's a German lager that Cashel brews, and he becomes quite successful. A successful entrepreneur. When I write my novels, I always like people to have sort of real jobs in a way, or do real unusual things. And so I was researching that period of American romanticism, Thoreau classically, and Walden, and Cashel has his pond. But in the case of the ice business, that was actually true. So again, it's something I stumbled across, that ice was cut from New England lakes in the depths of winter in huge blocks, and was shipped around the world, to India, to Brazil, to the Caribbean, so people could cool their drinks. And it's a very short-lived industry, because pretty soon in the 19th century, they invented refrigeration. They could make ice. They didn't have to cut it. But for about 40 years, there were ice millionaires. And one of them was a man called Tudor, I think, who I put in the novel, who lived in Boston, made a fortune shipping ice around the world. But by the time he died, people had refrigerating plants, and the ice trade was over. It's a very short-lived moment in American industrial history.
One more question from the audience, and then we wrap it up. This was your footnotes are explanatory, but made me laugh. They brought me out of the story in such a good way, and I felt the connection to your sensibility. Some aren't necessary, but they're funny. What was your intent with these footnotes? Well,
again, it's to give the framing device some sort of validity, that I discovered this semi-completed autobiography and decided to rewrite it as a novel. And it's also to make it seem real again, that the person who asked the question is absolutely right, because a character disappears from the Cashel story, but I give them a footnote to explain what happened to them and who they married and when they died. And so as you're reading, almost unconsciously, you begin to think this is true and this is real. Oh goodness, their stately home is now open to the public on Wednesdays and Thursdays. And so this woman in Mayfair in the 1830s must have been an actual person. So it's part of my sleight of hand, if you like, my attempt to colonize the world of the real and make people believe that make my fictions seem so real, you begin to forget it's a fiction you're reading. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I love this book. I love this book. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Diana. I look forward to meeting you in person one day. And I look forward to that next novel on Stendhal soon. Not
Right.
yeah. Let's have it on my desk next week, please. Thank you.
I'll do that. Thank you so much. I had a great time. Thanks, Andrea. Really
Thank you
wonderful. Thank
so
you,
much.
Diana.
You.
Fantastic.
Bye.
Brilliant.
Thank you,
Okey-doke.
Diana.
Bye.
Bye bye.